Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Conspiracy Farm, where we don't start the conspiracies, we just add the water. And now, your host of the most state-of-the-art, most informed podcast on the interweb, I present to you Pat Miletich and Jeffrey Wilson. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for war?
Here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Another episode for the archives. Jeffrey Wilson, the Conspiracy Farm, riding shotgun with my partner in crime, UFC Hall of Famer, Eater of Worlds, Pat Miletich. How are we, champ?
I'm doing good. I was, in a career that punched me into being interested in the unknown. So look, here I am.
Well, like you said with Joe Rogan when you were on, you're a contrarian thinker, man, and you kind of gravitate toward other contrarian thinkers. We really haven't.
We think the opposite of what we're taught because we're being taught that for a reason. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, and conspiracy theorists. I really kind of object to that term, even though our show is called the Conspiracy Farm. We're just critical thinkers, man. We question official narratives, et cetera, et cetera. And the conversation we're having today is like, whoa. This gentleman not only questions kind of the official narrative on things, but he's really dug deep down the rabbit hole to make some very, very interesting connections on things, man. Doing the show prep on this was really, really fascinating. We've been doing shows on ancient civilizations. Civilizations have come and gone. The hidden truth about that fact. And this gentleman, man, has a very, very interesting take on all of that. David Mathisen is joining us today. He's really an author, just pumping out just books like a champ. Star myths of the world, ancient myths, ancient wisdom, and a great many more, man. He just is essentially one of his quotes that I found fascinating. Well, we'll get into it. David Mathisen, how are you doing today, sir? And thank you for taking the time and hanging out with us.
I'm really good, Jeffrey, and Pat, thanks for having me on the show. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, so thanks for inviting me.
For sure, brother. For sure, man. And it's very fascinating to hear like alternative philosophies on stuff. Like I said, we've had on different people like Matt LaCroix, kind of saying what you're saying about the myths that we've heard about have a certain, different civilizations kind of utilize these myths in different ways, and your analysis and your study is no exception. So, like I said, I want to set you up and kind of have you kind of explain what you do. And a quote that I kind of found fascinating is something I think that you could really kind of expound on. All the world's myths are based on a common system of celestial metaphor. Help us out with that, man. Talk us about how you got into this work and what your work is all about, kind of related to what I just said. What's Matthew Mathisen all about? Or, I'm sorry, David Mathisen all about?
Yeah, that's great. So when I say all the world's myths are based on celestial metaphor, I mean the ancient myths that are given to every culture on our planet has these original instructions, is what a author that I like named Peter Kingsley has called these ancient traditions or sacred stories that are given to every people around the world. We find all the way around the world that every culture has some kind of set of sacred stories or original instructions. I really like that term. And in some cultures, those are passed down orally.
Right.
By stories or song. A lot of times it's in verse, which I think is probably important. The fact that even the Greek myths are written down in verse. Yeah. The Vedas of India are written down in verse. So there's a connection to music and harmony and rhythm, but sometimes they're passed down orally in a sacred tradition that has to be memorized by certain wisdom keepers or storytellers. And sometimes they've been written down, and we call those scriptures, usually ancient scriptures. Obviously, the Bible is called scriptures, but the Vedas of ancient India are scriptures. The Greek myths are recorded in scriptures that have survived. The Egyptian texts that are carved into stone are a form of scripture. So when I'm talking about the ancient myths, I'm talking about the ancient myths, scriptures, and sacred stories of virtually every single culture on every inhabited continent and every inhabited island across the Pacific. We have a culture that's spread out across the Pacific Islands, and they have myths that involve the hero Maui and many other
Right.
figures and gods and characters.
Right.
And all these, when I say they're all based on celestial metaphor, or I'll say virtually all, because I don't pretend to have seen every single myth in every single culture, but it is unbelievable amount of evidence that these stories are all based on celestial metaphor, by which I mean that the figures in those myths, the characters, whether it's Zeus or Thor or Odin or all the figures in the Bible from the beginning, all the way from Genesis, all the way to Revelation, those texts that are collected in the scriptures that we call the Bible, the figures like Moses and David and Solomon and Jesus and all the 12 disciples are based on specific constellations in the night sky. And
so
those,
is that to say like these people did, or did like David or Moses did exist, and then they utilized these constellations to kind of tell their story? Or you're saying they utilize these constellations to kind of not fabricate but create these stories?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So I'll always try and stick to what I can show with evidence, and I'll say, I don't know because I wasn't there, but I'll tell you that the evidence is pretty overwhelming to me that they're all based on celestial metaphor. And so some people really, really have a hard time letting go of the idea that they might also have been historical. I'm not sure why that is, that people have, that the stories have to involve a historical person to have truth that's applicable to our life. But the problem that a lot of people say, well, couldn't Moses have lived? But, all these stories about him are based on the stars. Okay, well, what I'm saying is all the stories that are in the text can be shown to be based on actual constellations and groupings of stars. And then when you go across the ocean to the Maui stories, and he's doing something very similar. For example, Samson slays 1,000 men with a jawbone, the jawbone of an ass, right? That's in the book of Judges. And all the way across the world in the Pacific, Maui takes up the jawbone of his grandmother at one point and uses that as a weapon. So for people who say, well, couldn't Samson have been a real character? I say, well, of course he could have been. But there's a constellation that I believe Samson is, that story is based on at that point, and there's a jawbone of an ass right next to that constellation that Samson uses. But if Samson, Samson is real, then is Maui not real? Or did they both just happen to choose a jawbone? And then there's actually a South American myth where a different character uses a jawbone. So either people are using jawbones around the world, and they just happen to all, match up with constellations.
I get that. But that's what the reason my question was, because we had on another gentleman, Matthew LaCroix, and I've read other research where it's like we had, as you even stated, civilization has come and gone multiple times throughout history. And a lot of times when you go back to your Nag Hammadi scriptures, your Sumerian kings list, very, very ancient stuff that supposedly actually happened, and then throughout history, whether it's Zeus, Apollo, Neptune, etc., they utilize these different myths of Norse myths, Roman myths, Greek myths to explain something that actually happened back in the day.
Right.
But I just
no,
go ahead, Pat.
And not to actually complicate things, but you think about David and Goliath. They've actually exposed civilizations of giants. They're and the interesting thing is when we've had scientists on before who are brilliant people, they say, well, yeah, they've exposed civilizations of giants. Animals were huge back then. Why wouldn't the humans have been huge? And so there's a lot of potential truth to this stuff that it actually happened too.
Well, and even getting into, and I'll let you kind of go with this, David, you're kind of, whatever you want to call it, Da Vinci Code, this notion that there are hidden secrets within the architecture, not just the physical architecture, but like where these places, these buildings were placed, or, just the certain mathematics of it. There's information in paintings, Da Vinci and these different great artists hid certain things. in certain works of their art. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, definitely go check out David Mathisen's page, because the visual representation of this is really, really powerful. Because like I told David off air, you know, just watching what he was saying about how these myths have been used over and over again, look at, particularly what stood out to me was Hercules. These different time frames of where this image of this person with his hand up, leg back, heel up, there's certain visual is consistent throughout certain time periods. So I mean, I think there's a lot of credence to what you're saying. I'm just wondering if it's something like WWE, ancient WWE. Well, let's just create history, guys, and then utilize the stars just to create a reality, when that could absolutely be true. But I just find it interesting juxtaposing with other research we've heard that actual stuff did occur, and they utilize these myths to kind of explain ancient stuff that did occur. But there's no doubt that there's huge symbolic links in what you're saying as far as the visual of so many different works of art throughout history.
Yeah,
and linking to constellations.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you've, dug so much into my stuff, Jeffrey, and I've been listening to my Conspiracy Farm and getting ready to talk on the show. And one thing I really love about your show is that you said it, almost in these exact words to some guest not too long ago. I just love it that we can come on the air and talk about things in a civil way, and we don't always have to necessarily agree with one another. Right. There's hardly, I don't think there's any two human beings in the world that agree with one another on 100% of things, but just because you, Pat, and me don't all agree on exactly, at the end of the conversation, we may not all agree, but I love talking about the evidence. So, and I love also that other researchers are exploring. I think there's a lot of exploring going on about misrepresentations that we've been told about history.
And you talked about Graham Hancock.
Search for truth, right?
Yeah. You talked about Graham a lot in your stuff, and that's another person who's questioned stuff. I'm sorry, Pat, what did you say there?
I was just saying, it's a beautiful search for the truth.
Without a doubt.
There's no anger in the truth.
Right.
Exactly. You don't have to get angry if you're so I try and really to not get too, because this is a vast subject, as Jeffrey's already mentioned some of the artwork, which we can draw into the conversation too. But what I really like to try and start with is, let me explain some of the evidence of what I found. Then we could talk about maybe where it came from. And to Pat's point about, giant skeletons, I certainly don't deny that there's been giant skeletons. In fact, you mentioned, it was really neat that I got to, I met Graham Hancock a couple of times, but I got to be at the Serpent Mound when he was there in 2017 at summer solstice, which we're coming up again on a summer solstice here as we record this on June 18th in 2019, right? But in 2017, I was there at the Serpent Mound when Graham Hancock was there giving a talk with Ross Hamilton. It was fantastic. I got to give a little presentation about the work that I'm doing, and we got to look at the Serpent Mound and see the sunsets, as they're going down that the head of the serpent is pointing to. But also there at the Serpent Mound site, there are mounds, like grave mounds, where there were giant skeletons, at least allegedly found in the 1800s and taken away. Mm-hmm. And they talked about, this skeleton was 9 feet tall, and basically there was no legs from the kneecaps on down. Those bones were missing, and it was 9 feet from there. So, wow. They have records from people who are writing this in the 1800s who, I don't know if they're, it's not like we had a YouTube video of what they were doing, exactly. But I don't know why they would be lying about that. And they were describing, this skeleton had this on his arm, this kind of bracelet, and this skeleton had this kind of dagger, but it all kind of fell apart when we tried to pick it up. So where it came from, I've got opinions about that, but I do, first of all, the amount of evidence worldwide that what I said about all the myths being based on the constellations is pretty overwhelming. I've now written basically 9 books, and they turn out to be pretty massive books. And I don't say that to brag about writing massive books. Actually, it'd probably be more accessible to people if they weren't so massive. But there's just so much evidence. I'm trying to chronicle it to show that this is very well supported by evidence from myths around the world. I've got a whole book that's myths, Greek myths, and tying it to the stars. I've got a whole book that's the star myths of the Bible. I've got a whole book that's star myths of the Norse mythology tying to the stars. And then I just redid the first book in that particular series, and I called it The Ancient Worldwide System, and it turned out to be 912 pages. Ooh. But the reason I could have broken it in, obviously, easily into smaller books, but I wanted to go all the way around the globe, basically, from Australia to Africa to ancient India, and all the way around basically to every longitude as you circle our spherical Earth, and show that it goes to the Americas.
Was that a jab at flat Earth, David? Was that a jab at flat Earth there?
I get so many people that come on and, they don't want to talk about what I'm discovering. They say, yeah, this is great, but how come you don't know the world is flat? And I'm like, well, I haven't figured that out yet. But anyway, I'm pretty convinced. I've written a blog post about 12 ways you can know that the world is not is spherical without having to go up in a rocket ship. But anyway, the reason I put this whole kind of world tour into one book is to kind of try and show the resonance as it builds and builds as you go around the world. So first, I would say that the evidence is very, very overwhelming. And we could talk about a few specific examples if you want, after I'll pause. But
absolutely. No, go for it, brother.
Then we can get into, well, how did this all get here? And at that point, I am giving you my opinion, because I can tell you, look, here's the evidence that Thor is based on the stars. Here's the evidence that this story from the New Testament is based on the stars. And that's very evidence-based.
Well, and when you get into the placement of, I didn't mean to cut you up, but the pyramids at Giza, their placement is lined up with Orion. That was not built in 4500 BC for the pharaoh Khufu. This was built way, way longer before, and this supposedly ancient civilization had an understanding of the circumference of the Earth, pi, the golden ratio, Fibonacci sequence. And that was supposedly, these ancient people. So clearly something, they received some measure of technology or understanding of the stars that we clearly don't understand. Well, don't understand today, but it makes you wonder, how are these ancient people doing these magnificent things?
Yeah. So then that's another aspect to the story, is how did we lose this knowledge? Because what I think happened was a lot of this knowledge was kind of, not kind of stamped out deliberately.
For sure.
And we could get into that, but so the alignment,
the great floods, which we've talked about before.
Yeah, the different cataclysms.
I was going to just say on the alignments of the pyramids, to the argument that they're lined up like the stars of Orion's belt is really not my argument. It's more Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock have written about that.
Oh, for sure.
But I do, and I think they've got a strong argument there, but I don't rise or fall on that particular argument. But it is amazing the correspondence that you mentioned, for instance, of the Great Pyramid to the dimensions of the Earth. I mean, there's a ratio between the height and the base and the dimensions of the Great Pyramid that corresponds to the size of our spherical Earth, or specifically the Northern Hemisphere. Yeah. And you could say, well, there's a ratio between any building and the size of the Earth, right? There's a ratio between my house and the size of the Earth, but it actually comes to a ratio that has the number 432 in it. And 432 is one of those processional numbers that has to do with the celestial phenomena of procession, which is encoded in all these myths as well. It's in the Odyssey. Sure. It's in the Norse myths. So
they were able to learn this from observations of the stars, and there was no, let's say, alien influence on any of this, or is that possible?
Yeah. So once again, so people say, well, could it have been aliens? I'm not on the ancient alien, is a necessity to give this to people. I would say that you don't need aliens for this story. And actually, my research in some cases goes against a lot of the UFO or ancient alien community likes to say that the myths are a primitive reaction to seeing spaceships. Like, well, when they're talking about angels, what that is a UFO that's shining. You know, and a modern person would say, well, that's its plasma discharge, but the ancient person would describe it as an angel or something like that. So a lot of when I'm showing that, well, this is actually the vision of Ezekiel, for instance, is often said, well, that's a primitive attempt to try and describe a UFO.
Right.
It's actually not that at all. It's a sophisticated metaphor showing basically what we would call an armillary sphere, or describing a model of the heavens and how the ecliptic plane tilts up, and in the summer the sun makes an arc that's above the celestial equator. In the winter, the sun makes an arc that's below the celestial equator.
Right.
And all those things are described in the vision of Ezekiel, and it's a very precise metaphor. That's a celestial metaphor. It's not a UFO. But that being said, like I said, I'm showing this evidence exists. Where it all came from, I would argue it came from some ancient, there's some pretty good evidence that this came from an ancient culture that predates ancient Egypt by a long way, predates ancient Mesopotamia by a long way, and was very sophisticated, very sophisticated. And it stands alongside all that archaeological evidence that people like Graham Hancock and John Anthony West are talking about. And they talk about the myths too. But the evidence that when we see that the same system is being used in ancient Egypt, that's being used in the Popol Vuh of the Maya, that's being used in the myths of Maui, that's being used in the myths of Australia, that's being used in the myths of Africa, that's being used in the Norse myths, that is very hard to explain with our conventional view of modern history that says, well, you know, the Maya never had any contact with the Europeans, and they didn't necessarily have to have any contact with Europeans or with Egyptians or with you know, the Norse. There's parallels between the Norse myths and the Japanese myths, but I don't believe that either of those cultures needed to have contact with one another if they all came. If what happened was there was a very ancient culture, and Pat, it could have been a race of giants, a culture of giants that us smaller humans all, you know, eventually ganged up on and killed.
Well, that's
Maybe
what we heard.
The origin.
We've heard about Atlantis. Billy Carson was on talking about Atlantis, and I've read this before. Atlantis wasn't necessarily this higher technology just in the Atlantic Ocean. It was a global civilization. That's why you find so many of these megalithic structures, whether it's in, you know, Teotihuacan in Mexico,
all over the world,
over the world, Bosnia, or Göbekli Tepe. I mean, going back way further than we think, you know, advanced people were around. So it is very fascinating. And it, you know, honestly, when we have these conversations, for me, I never am. I'm like, this is it. Like, this is the bona fide truth, because there's more questions than answers.
The science is not settled, Jeffrey.
It's not settled, but it's so beautiful because between our conversation we're having with David here, even Matthew or Billy or whatever, we're at least acknowledging that we haven't been told the full story. Like, something was going on before, even way before. And again, ladies and gentlemen, go to David Mathisen's YouTube page, and his words make so much more sense when you see the connection of these different artifacts and art throughout the world.
Yeah, and David, you're saying that and I don't doubt it, because, you know, there's a website based on ancient star maps, and it's the name of the website is escaping me right now. A former broadcast partner of myself pointed me to it, and it was a gentleman who was a scientist and Freemason and astrologer who had put it together, and it pointed toward Pleiades and other areas of the stars, of the constellations, that said that basically humans came from was, you know, their belief. So they're talking up to 250,000 years ago and further. So King Sargon of Akkad in Mesopotamia at 4,000 years ago was nothing compared to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, so this is interesting. So you mentioned Sargon, and Sargon and Mesopotamia, that's where we get our earliest, basically, long texts that have survived. There are ancient texts from India, there are ancient texts from Egypt, but the Sumerian tablets are considered by conventional archaeology to be the oldest ones that we have. The
Sumerian Kings list, where kings supposedly reigned for tens of thousands of years.
And some of those oldest texts, like the stories of the Great Flood, and that it was very shocking to the Assyriologists in the 1800s when they first began to be able to
decipher
that again after it being lost basically for thousands of years. And they found a flood narrative that was so similar to the Genesis narrative, but from tablets that were like 3000 BC. And the Genesis, account is basically, the Gilgamesh. And so what I was going to say, and the Gilgamesh does have an encounter with the flood survivor in the last tablets of Gilgamesh. And then there's another text called Atrahasis and Enuma Elish. And these texts talk about gods and goddesses and great cataclysms and battles between the deities, and also a flood where they try and wipe out or one of the gods tries to wipe out mankind, but Enki tries to save mankind and
Enki and Enlil. And so that's kind of where I was alluding to before, of this ancient war with this ancient family. The Sumerian Kings list talks about kingship came from above to the earth. I mean, there's so many allusions to something going on. I don't know if it was extraterrestrials or whatever it was, but this ancient civilization that had this kind of sibling rivalry or like family war, and then throughout time, it kind of goes a little crazy, ladies and gentlemen. Not crazy, but it's just interesting how these individuals could reincarnate to, like, Enki was Neptune. And then Neptune became this person, and then Neptune morphed into this person, mythologized through these different Greek and Norse mythology. So fascinating. It's good that you've heard about the whole Enlil and Enki, because that was kind of the thrust of certain literature I've read.
Yeah. So, and those are very, very ancient tablets that these are inscribed upon, and those stories, and I argue this at some pretty great length in my most recent book, which is The Ancient Worldwide System. That's Star Myths of the World, Volume 1, are based on the stars. So Enki is based on a certain constellation, and Enlil is based on a different constellation, and the battle between the forces of Tiamat and Apsu are based on different constellations on different sides of the Milky Way.
Interesting.
And so what the really interesting thing to me is that the very oldest myths that we have, this system is already operating. And then equally as old, we have the ancient Egyptian pyramid texts, which also go back to some of those pyramids from the 4th dynasty kings and queens are going back to also before 3000 BC. And on those texts, they're not necessarily telling a long, coherent story the same way that the Mesopotamian tablets are.
Right.
They're these, the pyramid texts are almost like the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They're all actually part of the same family of type of writing, but they'll make references to Osiris. They'll make references to Horus, and all of those stories can also be seen to be based on the same system. So what I'm saying is the oldest texts that we have are already using this system. And the ancient Vedas, which are also very ancient, using this same system. The gods and goddesses of ancient India, same system. And then in China, we've got some very ancient texts as well. And I make arguments that show same system. So if the oldest civilizations that we know of are already using this system, where'd they get it from?
Right.
Because they must have got it from something older. And then you mentioned Göbekli Tepe, Jeffrey, I think, when you were talking there for a little while. And Göbekli Tepe is only a recent, phenomenon, a recent discovery that we have access to Göbekli Tepe. It was deliberately buried.
Yeah.
And they can date the burial material and say this was deliberately buried.
Isn't that bizarre?
No later. Yeah, that's a huge amount of work to bury that in. It's an enormous site, 8,000 BC. So if you think about if it was buried no later than 8,000 BC, which is 10,000 years ago for us.
I've heard even older, pushing closer to like 14, but old.
Well, it had to have been made before it was buried, right? So who knows how long it was in operation before it was buried. And so if you think back, how long ago were the Egyptians to us? We're here in 2000 AD or 2019. The Egyptians that we're talking about, 2,500 to 3,000 BC, that's 5,000 years ago, right? And some of that stuff may be much older, as John Anthony West and others.
The Sphinx, for sure.
Yeah. But let's say, the dynastic Egypt, 3000 BC and forward. So 5,000 years ago. Well, how old was Göbekli Tepe in 3000 BC.
Way
If it
older
was
than
buried by 8000,
Yeah.
it was buried by 8000. It's as old to them as Egypt is to us.
Right.
Right? I mean,
Well, and what are your thoughts on these different cataclysms that could have wiped out so many? I mean, there could be more evidence of it, but, you know, we don't quite get it. But, I mean, if we, like the Ice Ages, you know, you had a couple of miles of ice on whatever civilization had over a couple thousand years, 100,000 years, that's going to grind down whatever was there, or even the cataclysms that destroyed everything. What are your thoughts on,
Right.
I mean, just there could be absolutely so many different civilizations that have come and gone, but through cataclysms and erosion in hundreds of thousands of years, we just don't have any evidence for it as much as we would like.
Yeah. Really important.
But we
part
find
of
these
the
structures
story.
that lend itself to, man, this is old. Where did this come from? And then like Graham Hancock says, shit's always getting older, man. And so it's like, where did this come from? Wow, where did this come from?
Right. So I think cataclysms is a very important part of the story. I mean, you can look around the earth and see that we've had cataclysms. And there, you know, Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson, who I know you've had Randall on your show.
Love that guy, dude. Jeez.
And they've talked about catastrophism as opposed to uniformitarianism, and that actually gets into going back to taking the Bible literally. I mean, we've covered already a lot of ground, and I'm arguing that the Bible is based on celestial metaphor. And at some point in ancient history, the Bible was all these ancient stories were decided, no, this has to be taken literally. And then people who were taking it literally went and imposed their will on a whole lot of other people. And there was a reaction against that, because for centuries it was taught, well, you have to take the Bible literally or else we will, you know, put you to death, or you know, so you have to take the flood story literally, and it had to have been, you know, in the year that we said it was.
Yeah.
And then there was a big reaction against that in the beginning in the late 1700s, early 1800s, of geologists who said, we need to come up with a theory. Well, it's not that they wanted to come up with a theory to defeat the Bible, but they were saying, look, there's a lot of stuff on earth that's much older than what the biblical literalists will allow us to say. So they became almost fanatical anti-catastrophists. So they didn't want to even admit that catastrophe could have played a huge role. And then they wanted to say, well, everything that you see, the Grand Canyon was formed by basically uniformitarian trickle of water just acting over enormous periods of time. Well, the Grand Canyon was not a trickle of water. It was some kind of a gusher.
Well, exactly. That's why I love Randall Carlson's work so much, because him and Graham, especially Randall, has gone so deep into the Younger Dryas area, that scab lands up in the Northwest, where it's like you cannot dispute some of the geological erratics from basically Canada and upper North America winding up in wherever, you know, way south, Idaho or whatever the hell, because they were carried by this huge flush of water. And he, you know, through geological evidence has found that, you know, these carvings throughout the freaking terrain were not done over the course of thousands of years. It was almost overnight. And this resistance, almost like Egyptology and Zahi Hawass, were totally mind-fucked when Bauval and John Anthony West came in with their evidence on the Sphinx. Like, the conventional science is so resistant to this new information. It's so frustrating, man.
And a lot of the new information, I think, is, you know, based on human control. A lot of the religious, you know, writings and things like that, obviously, and history, obviously, is intended to control the masses.
Yeah, that's a huge part of the story too. So, exactly. I mean, we're going at 90 miles an hour, and it's a wild ride, and your listeners are used to that pace. But just to
dial it in, boys. Dial it in.
Hit the brake pedal. Hit the brake.
Let me just at least I'll shift down to a lower gear. I don't necessarily have to hit the brakes, but so it was actually John Anthony West and Robert Schoch that were
Schoch. You're right. I'm sorry, not Bauval.
But no, that's all right. But it's really important, the catastrophe evidence, and Robert Schoch has a different take on the catastrophe than Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson are more on the comet. Robert Schoch is more on the solar coronal mass ejections, which can be extremely devastating and drive people to have to actually live underground. But whatever, and it could have been a combination, I don't know, but whatever wiped out this. So just to dial back to Göbekli Tepe And the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, now I'm not the first one to notice this, have, first of all, very smooth edges, very large stones. It's very high relief, highly artistic carvings on the outside of them that show. It's like if you're a hunter-gatherer society and you're moving from place to place and hunting, you don't necessarily have time to develop skills, extraneous skills of gigantic stone carving in precision edges. And
you're trying to survive.
You know, it's like, yeah, I'd love to be an artist, but right now I got to go hunt this deer right now or I'm going to starve. So it looks like this was a society that had full-time artists. Yeah, full-time artists and full-time stone workers.
Right.
And that kind of division of labor usually requires more diversification of labor and economics, right? But whatever the story of Göbekli Tepe is, those carvings, and I'm not the first to notice this, have parallels to constellations. There's a scorpion right below a winged bird, which looks like it could have the same angle of the wings as the bow in Sagittarius, which is right next to Scorpio. And the scorpion is unmistakably a scorpion.
Okay, so here's kind of the crux of my thing. So maybe they did have an understanding of celestial movements from ancient stuff. Where did they get the tech at that point in time to do a Göbekli Tepe, to create a Göbekli Tepe? I mean, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. They can still understand the stars, but it's like, where did they get that tech from?
Right. And so, you know, I know
I'm not discounting the alien things, or I know you guys said something about aliens, but it's like, you know, something was there, right? Am I crazy?
So what I think is that there was a very advanced human civilization, and it doesn't necessarily need to have been advanced, quote unquote, in the same technology types that we have today. But it was certainly spiritually sophisticated, I would argue, because whoever came up with these myths are very profound, and they have what I'd really like to get into, especially, you know, we have here this tremendous resource of someone who has reached the highest pinnacles of sport and been a UFC, you know, champion. So you don't get to, not everybody can do that, but you don't get to that level without being able to control certain types of things in your mind and have certain kinds of discipline. And I think that a lot of these myths have to do with overcoming, reintegrating with your authentic self and things like that, overcoming anxiety. I mean, I'm sure that if you're going to go get into a ring with somebody, you maybe have a twinge of anxiety once in a while. You know, maybe Pat didn't, but I would if I was jumping into an MMA ring. And I think
they all did, but more than anything else, the intelligence of, you know, some of the stonework that looks like it's literally melted together in perfect geometrical shapes.
Yes.
We can't match it. We can't match the pyramids. We can't match any of this stuff. We can't even come close to medieval castles. We can't remotely build any of it. And the formulas for doing this stuff and how these stones were cut and how they were put together and how these massive stones were lifted is beyond us. We don't have cranes big enough to lift these stones and put them in place. I'm telling you, man, it's you know, when we had Billy on, you know, he talked about, you know, vibration.
Using sound.
Source of sound being the source of moving these stones. And I said, really, that potentially is because now we're experimenting with sound. We're moving objects with sound. That's potentially the only way these things got moved in at least our human comprehension.
Right.
Yep, and that's exactly right. And actually some of the stones, and so Graham Hancock's latest book, America Before, posits that ancient civilization might have actually been in the Americas. And some of the stonework in Pumapunku, which is in South America, and those are some of those giant H-shaped, and they're all identical in their precision, and
right.
they fit together, and it's amazing, and they look like they had some kind of maybe metal staple or place for some kind of stapling to go between these giant blocks of stone, but they're all blasted all over the place like they were hit by some kind of a gigantic earthquake or explosion. So I think we were trying to answer the question of, is a cataclysm an important part of this story? I think it is, because I think that it may have predated Göbekli Tepe by some period of time when this culture was flourishing, and there may have been some kind of tremendous catastrophe that caused that civilization to either be destroyed or a few survivors to go underground.
Göbekli Tepe know it was coming and
Possibly.
bury it
and bury all their stuff. Absolutely. And so
was it buried by the sediment from the flood?
Well, and we can talk about the flood. I mean, my first book is actually about evidence for a worldwide flood catastrophe, and it's that. And I wrote that book actually while I was still taking the Bible literally. And there's a fascinating theory by a geologist named Dr. Walt Brown, and he's also a West Point graduate like myself, and I really enjoy his.
He's only graduated from there, right?
Say again?
You graduated from West Point, dude?
Yeah, you didn't get that on the background check there, Jeffrey? No, I'm just kidding, man. I'm just kidding.
That's awesome.
Yeah, a long time ago. But anyway,
and the school at West Point was way easier when David graduated.
I just about blew my beer into the microphone just there as I was taking a sip when you said that. Let's not go down that road right this second.
That's quite right.
But yeah, so interesting. But this sophisticated culture, it's possible that they had to go underground and that they disseminated the myths or the system. Or it's also possible that the survivors ending up on all these, or eventually making their way to all these different parts of the world, retained a memory of this ancient system, and then it took on different costumes or different flavors in Australia, as it would take on a different costume or a flavor in Australia as it would in Scandinavia or as it would in South America or something.
What is your I'm sorry, Jeff.
Go ahead, buddy.
What is your knowledge on the Katora tomb in Japan?
Ooh, you got me there, Pat. Well, tell me about it.
Well, it's an ancient. They say that it is the oldest.
Graham explored it.
It's the oldest of tombs in terms of having the constellations, the accurate constellations carved in the ceiling of the tomb in Japan. Mm-hmm. So that's something that I had read some time ago, and and all the way back to, I think it's 17,000 years ago in the West, there's basic diagrams and carvings, cave carvings of Pleiades and stuff like that, but not near as defined and showing the procession of the stars and the constellations movement and everything else. But the oldest accurate one is from Japan, from a tomb.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Kitora, the Katora tomb in, God, I'm trying to remember. It's a tomb in Akira, Japan, is where it is.
Yeah, that's very cool.
I have no idea how I remembered that.
That's great. Now I'll check it out. But I'll tell you that, for sure, around the world, the archaeological evidence is that the stars were part of this system. I mean, the system that's in the myths is also reflected in the architecture and is reflected in the artwork, as we alluded to. And as you mentioned, I think, Pat, you were just saying the caves, even the Lascaux caves, these famous caves in France, which have tremendous acoustic qualities, and they have this beautiful artistic work, and it's usually attributed to, well, this was cavemen or cave women. Those, and I wasn't the first one to argue this either, but I've looked at some of those paintings and some of the arguments of people who've said, look, this lines right up with the constellation Leo. Look at the tail of this rhinoceros. It's really actually the same stars that we would call the head of Leo, and right in between. Yeah. We've got Gemini right in the right place, which is right basically in front of Leo, and the Pleiades are there as well. Extremely important constellation. So, or not constellation, star cluster. But But so what I would say is that, although I'm not able to talk to the Keturah tomb, I'm sorry, I'll check it out and maybe you'll see a blog post about it eventually.
No,
But
Graham Hancock.
I'd love to analyze it.
Well, I was going to say the myths of Japan I have analyzed, and they're in this most recent book too. So I do the myths of ancient China and Japan, and two different chapters on China and a different chapter on Japan, and there are myths that are preserved in a text called the Kojiki of ancient Japan, and
somebody's home.
And yeah, you got that. That's one teenager there. So the Kojiki of ancient Japan can all be shown to be based on the constellations, or I would argue are overwhelmingly. The evidence is overwhelming, extremely compelling, I would say, at least, or
for sure.
I would argue it's conclusive that they're based on the same thing.
Our boy, Graham Hancock, there's footage of him doing some scuba diving off the coast of Japan with some underground megalithic structures that were actually obviously above ground. Going back to something Pat just said.
Underwater.
Yeah. Going back to something Pat just said and just kind of getting this understanding of how these ancient peoples understand it. Obviously, you have to be familiar with Gerald Clark as well as Zacharias Sitchin. And some of these Sumerian cuneiforms were seeing the sun as well as all these different planetary bodies that we now know as our solar system around it, which they had no fucking clue what the solar system looked like back in the day, but clearly they had an ancient understanding of it. So, I mean, again, that just kind of lends itself to something was going on. There was some kind of tech, something that they knew about back in the day. And, between your work and like these other works about, I'm hearing, it's like, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, as we say. We don't have to agree on everything. But I think in this middle ground, there is some truth, obviously. And again, I hate to be redundant. Go to my man's page here, David Mathisen, and find out visually how these things link together, because us just explaining it verbally doesn't really make sense. But I think there's more to these myths than just the constellation. But I think they were using the constellations, almost like I said earlier, in Da Vinci's work or these artists' work. They're secrets within the art that's ancient, that goes back a long ways, and they're trying to tell us something. And as much as we like to foo-foo astrology and astronomy or whatever, maybe there's more juice in the constellation and celestial processions than we even begin to realize.
Yeah, and if you want, why don't we take a look at a few examples, and we can talk about, we can describe some of the connections between a few myths and stars. If you want to go to a biblical story or a specific body of myth. Or
let me throw out a biblical story of was it Jacob that had the wrestling match with God? Right?
Yeah, good one.
In this story, people think there's a place called Phineas, but Phineas doesn't exist. Phineas actually represents the pineal gland, which is the third eye, right? The all-seeing eye, the connection to God, our connection to God that's supposedly being calcified by the use of fluoride and everything else. And I think I've talked about this before on one other show, I think. But when it talks about God breaking Jacob's leg and this epic battle that he had with God and everything else, Phineas didn't exist. It's the pineal gland. It is that sort of thing that are these stories that everybody takes literally, that, oh my God, Jacob had a wrestling match with God and everything else. And no, that's not. These people were very highly educated that wrote a lot of this stuff, and you're too dumb to decipher it.
Yeah, so it's actually Peniel is the it's not Peneus with an S. It's actually Peniel. If you go back.
Well, the pineal gland is.
Yeah, but actually in the Bible itself too.
Is it Peniel?
Yeah, in the, but that's okay. The word El means God. So we have Beth El, which is also involved in that same story, which means the house of God, and that's right, where Jacob has the vision of Jacob's ladder, or the staircase that goes, the stairway to heaven, that when he rests his head upon a rock after that same incident, and he sees he sees the vision of the angels ascending and descending on this ladder. Or it might not have been the exact same incident, but it's in the same book of Genesis. So, and I talk about this in Star Myths of the Bible, which I don't have within easy reach, but let me tell you what I think is going on celestially. So Peniel, and we can get back to the pineal gland, whether it also connects to the pineal gland, I certainly don't deny that possibility, but it's also, this story can be found in the sky. So what happens is Jacob is crossing the river at the ford called Jabbok, Jabbok. If I'm not referencing the scriptural text right now, I'm just talking out of my memory, but, and
to Sierra Nevada.
And a Sierra Nevada, which I hope doesn't have any fluoride in it, right? So otherwise my memory will be even more twisted. But so he encounters what's actually described as an angel or the angel of the Lord, and then later it is kind of becomes clear that he's wrestling with the Lord, and that's why he calls the place Peniel, because this is where I wrestled with the Lord, El, or God, El. Many names in the ancient scriptures have El in them, like Beth El, the house of God, or which Bethlehem is also related to that. And El, that sound syllable El is also found in the Greek sun. There's a titan of the sun who becomes a sun god, Helios. Helios. And when we say hello to one another, we're actually saying a word that's derived from Helios, the sun god. And so Peniel, or all these words that have El in the end of them, are referring to a name of God that is related to the sun god in Greek myths. But he wrestles with an angel. There's actually a constellation. Oh, and then the angel. So there's a wrestling match. There's lots of wrestling matches in the ancient
first
myths.
WWE. I love it.
Yeah, there is a lot of wrestling, and I actually believe this has to do with reconnecting with our higher self, because I believe we get divided from our authentic self in this world. Like, we're divided from ourselves, and we have to reintegrate with who we are. And so after Gilgamesh and Enkidu have this big wrestling match, then they become fast friends, and they become almost like twins. You can hardly tell them apart. It's the same thing. This wrestling goes on in many, many myths, and it's usually a mortal and an immortal, or a divine and someone who's human. And so in this case, it's Jacob and this angel of the Lord, and the angel finally says, well, I can't actually defeat this guy, but I'm going to touch the hollow of his hip, or the hollow of his thigh is what it says, and it shrunk the tendon. It says something like his tendon shrunk up, and then from ever after that, he kind of had a limp because of this wrestling match with God at Peniel, at this ford. Well, there's a constellation in the heavens, it's actually close to the Pleiades, called Perseus. And Perseus, if you look at the constellation, actually has the feet look like they're twisted. And in fact, one leg is much shorter than the other leg. And Perseus, the head of the constellation, is in the Milky Way. It's not the brightest part of the Milky Way. It's the other side of the Milky Way from the brightest part. The brightest part is really in between Scorpio and Sagittarius. So on the other side of the sky, Perseus has his head in the Milky Way. So he's crossing the ford, and right next to Perseus is this angelic figure called Andromeda. And Andromeda is a beautiful maiden in the Greek myth of Perseus and Andromeda. So these same constellations, let me just give a parenthetical, will play different characters. It's just like the metaphor I use is like when you see an actor and he or she is playing in a movie, and you go, wait a minute, I know her, but oh man, she looks so different. Or he's using a totally different accent. You know, like Johnny Depp will look so different from one movie to another. Eventually you recognize, wait a minute, that's Johnny Depp. I didn't even recognize him. Well, that's what these constellations will do. Perseus plays the hero Perseus in a Greek myth, but Perseus plays many, many figures who have a twisted foot or a walk with a limp. Like there's a god named Hephaestus or Hephaestus who's Vulcan.
Hephaestus,
yeah. he's lame in both feet because one of his parents, either Zeus or Hera, throws him down from Olympus because they get angry with him. And ever after that, he has to ride on a donkey.
How does that coincide with what I was saying kind of earlier? These ancient Enlil Inkies wound up manifesting their very same self. They were playing different roles throughout different aspects of society, or civilization, whether it's Greek or Egyptian. You know, it's.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great insight, Jeffrey. So the ancients actually had no problem saying, like when the Romans were fighting. Like if you guys probably seen Gladiator, right?
Of course.
A million times.
Of course.
Are you not entertained?
Right, exactly. How are you not entertained? So in that is a very important figure. Marcus Aurelius is played by, who is it? He's in the Dirty Dozen.
Great actor.
He's the father of another great actor.
I can't remember.
I know, off the top. Donald Sutherland.
No, it's not Donald Sutherland.
No.
Isn't it not?
It's all right. It's not, but that's all right. Go ahead.
Kiefer Sutherland. Isn't he Kiefer Sutherland's father?
He is, but that's not who played
Marcus Aurelius.
That's not who played Marcus Aurelius.
I'll find it.
The emperor who gets killed by his son Commodus.
I understand. It was not Donald Sutherland.
All right. Well, my memory is faulty, but
so is mine. That's why I can't pull his name up, but I know it's not Donald Sutherland.
Marcus Aurelius was obviously a real emperor. Commodus was also a real emperor, and that's a very critical juncture in history, I would argue, for this whole story of how the myths got squelched. But maybe
his book Meditations is absolutely fantastic.
Russell Crowe, thank you.
Who was it?
Russell Crowe wasn't Marcus Aurelius.
No, he was fucking dude. He was the Spaniard. He was Maximus.
Joaquin Phoenix?
No, that's Commodus.
All right. Well, we're going off on a wild goose chase though. Just look up Marcus Aurelius though, Pat. See who played him. Yeah. I thought it was Donald Sutherland, but it doesn't matter.
It doesn't.
But Marcus Aurelius actually did fight against, he was off fighting battles against the Germanic tribes in the north. And the Romans, who were worshiping Jupiter, who corresponds to Zeus, and Mars, who corresponds to Ares in the Greek myths, had no problem saying, oh, these Germanic tribes worship a god that they call Tu or Tyr, and that corresponds to our god Mars, or they have a god who's like our god Hercules. They had no problem seeing that correspondence. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's a reincarnation. I think we're talking about the same entities or the same powers, the same invisible realm. So I believe that these myths are
with you. Almost like a Carl Jungian collective unconscious, if you will.
Richard Harris.
Oh, Richard Harris? Wow.
There you go.
Marcus Aurelius.
Wow. So Richard Harris played Marcus Aurelius. Good call, Pat. And he played Camelot. He played King Arthur.
Oh, fuck yeah.
In the 60s, the 1960s.
Sorry to throw the curveball at you, but anyway, continue.
There was once a dream called Rome. You could only whisper of it.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway, what I was going to say is that all around the world, these same gods and goddesses show up with the very same characteristics, because I believe what these ancient myths are doing are talking about an invisible realm. They're trying to teach us something about something that we can't see, and they're using a metaphor. And I've explained
as opposed to something that existed way before that, like a global Atlantean civilization that they all knew. Huge cataclysms happened. It was hidden for several years, but it had to be disseminated. It was, like you said, almost not being a Christian. It was illegal to disseminate this information about this ancient tech, so they had to do it through the paintings, through the geometry of architecture, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, so I use the metaphor of Mr. Miyagi trying to teach Daniel-san.
I like that.
Karate.
I heard that in that video. Go ahead, explain that, please.
And it's because, see, Daniel-san, Mr. Miyagi said, I'm going to have you wax all these cars. You have to do it just this right way. Wax on, wax off. Then I'm going to have you paint the fence. Then I'm going to have you sand the floor, and all these different things. And Daniel-san's like, wait a minute, man. I'm getting beaten up at school. I need to learn karate. And Mr. Miyagi was, and we could say, well, what was Mr. Miyagi trying to hide karate from Daniel-san by teaching him wax the car? By using this unusual system and not telling him, I need you to wax the car exactly this way. And later, Daniel-san learns what it's all about. That's the method. That's esoteric. It means you learn the wax on, wax off. Then suddenly you find out, oh, that's what it means. And I believe it's for empowering
But it
humans.
awakens something, not even just that, but the larger awakening of human consciousness is they're awakening something that's already there. It's not something like, that's why he had to use it, like you said, wax on, wax off. Because you said if you did like, crescent punch, roundhouse kick, it would just whatever. But when you do it in such a benign way, and then when you need it, it's almost that muscle reflex. It taps in to that almost unconscious, that, whatever you want to call it, the Akashic records, whatever. It's already there. It just needs to be awakened.
Well, and it had
and
to
why was it
bypass
already
a
there?
certain
That's almost an
part of
epigenetic DNA remembers going back. You know what I mean?
Well, what I was also going to say is it was very important to bypass Daniel-san's doubting mind, right? Daniel-san why was he getting picked on in school? He already had a lot of self-doubt. He was obviously he had to move to California from New Jersey. He was not happy. He's living in a broken family. He doesn't have a dad, and he has
it was a broken family. Nobody smoking crack and shit. It was a single mom. You know what I mean? She was busting her ass.
Well, what I'm saying is Daniel-san had issues of his own, right? I mean, we can't deny that.
As did Johnny and his crew who beat him up.
I'll grant you all that. But Daniel-san had doubts, and Mr. Miyagi saw, I can't just tell him, here's how you're going to stop Johnny's kick. Because Daniel-san will say, come on, really? Would that really work? He's going to say, well, what if Johnny kicks me this way? What if he does this? Instead, Mr. Miyagi bypassed that doubting part of Daniel's mind and went to the deeper understanding and got past the doubting part of Daniel's mind. And I think that's what these myths are showing over and over, with a character like Doubting Thomas being reconciled with Jesus in the story of it's not two people, it's one person becoming more integrated with who they are.
So an interesting question, I think, for you, David, is, do you believe Jesus was someone who walked the earth and did the ancient schools of mysteries and performed miracles or whatever they were, feats of magic? Do you believe he was an actual, because there's so many works of literature that are non-religious that talk about Jesus that it's almost impossible to claim that he never walked the earth, right?
Well, I used to believe that he was a literal figure, but no, I don't.
No?
Interesting. That's all right.
So tell us why that is.
Yeah, well, because all those stories are based on the stars, and Jesus is just like the Buddha is based on a very specific constellation. So the birth of the Buddha, the birth story of the Buddha, and if you look up on Wikipedia or if you go to college texts that talk about Buddha, Siddhartha, who became the Buddha, they'll say, well, we believe he lived around 500 BC. Well, the birth of the Buddha happened when, according to the birth story, his mother had this dream. She saw an elephant in her dream. The elephant went into her side. She woke up the next morning and she said to her husband, I'm pregnant. And he said, what? You what? And it was an immaculate conception. The mother's name was Maya in the story. She had a vision. She became pregnant with the baby. And when the baby was born, an old sage came to the king and queen. It was Queen Maya and her husband, I forget his name, the king. And he said, and the sage said, I've been waiting for the birth of this. This one is going to be, I saw these celestial wheels moving in the heavens. They were turned by invisible hands, and there were these whisks in the air that were turning the wheel. Well, in the birth of the Christ, you have a very similar pattern. Obviously, you have an immaculate conception, but you also have an old, aged holy man named Simeon who comes, and this is I believe it's in Luke chapter 2 or something, but I'm talking off the top of my head, so I don't know exactly. But he says this one will be for the rising and falling of many in Israel, which is the turning of the wheel. It's the pattern. I've written a whole blog post about it, and there's
even
also
that
a
whole
video
biography, like you're saying, like that biography of that big that Immaculate Conception. That's been Addis, that's been Mithra, that's been Isis, that's been the same, very similar biography of a Messiah that is to come, that dies, and then 3 days later is arisen. I mean, that biography of quote unquote Jesus Christ is festooned throughout history, and I still believe the cat existed. Quite frankly, I think he was the first hit of the deep state. You know, because he did have that understanding of secret, esoteric kind of understanding of the world, the things we're talking about, this ancient tech, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, but that's
Yeah, no, I mean, and you know, and I don't want to take away from people who believe, you know, very deeply or have their identity very closely wrapped up in taking it literally, if it works for you, as long as you don't use those literalistic beliefs. Where I think it goes too far is where you use them to justify the oppression of other people, which is exactly how it's been used for many. You know, we can see the, you know, colonialism.
But as you even said yourself, there is this understanding came from somewhere. Like when you look at your visual,
absolutely.
Yeah. So it's like how is it? I'm not. Reconcile, if you will, this what you've admitted, an understanding of this ancient kind of tech. There was some ancient civilization, something was going on, and you know this layout of kind of archaeological history, if you will, which has such a celestial tie to it. You know, from Göbekli Tepe to the pyramids to, man, I mean, so many different megalithic structures that at certain celestial times the sun shines through the hole they built. You know what I mean? I can't think of the specific spots, but they had it, we've agreed, there's been an ancient understanding of things. So how is it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Jesus
I mean,
wasn't just an extension of that. He supposedly worked with the Vedas. He supposedly worked with the Tibetans and understanding Eastern stuff.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I believe that the Bible is true. I just don't believe that it has to be literal to be true. I believe that the reason I took the Bible literally for decades, and I found, you know, I had my identity very much tied up in taking it literally. Then I went through this big transition where I started to see the connections to the stars, and I started to find more and more and more of them. And I said, you know what? I no longer can believe that this is literal, but it still doesn't mean, just because you're not taking something literally doesn't mean that it is not full of truth and, you know, positive
can't throw
message.
the baby out with the bathwater, right?
Right. And so, you know, and there's actually, you know, as you said, there are echoes of the Christ story in the Osiris story. There's a writer in the late 1800s named Gerald Massey who said, you know, this New Testament should really be called the even older Testament. And it's possible that Paul was revealing something that he wasn't supposed to reveal. There are passages where he says, this is the secret that's been kept secret, you know, and that's why people were after him, because he was revealing an ancient esoteric.
Well, I mean, you got so many different hands, man. Melchizedek, the high priest, the Zoroaster guy, like they were doing these same miracles, working from the same kind of playbook of these ancient cats, man.
Well, and so I would argue that Melchizedek and Jesus are almost, so Jesus is almost always, not always, but very often associated, I would argue, with the constellation Ophiuchus. And Ophiuchus is not a super well-known constellation.
It's a common one, though, from reading some.
Oh, it's an important one. Yeah. It's a super important one. It's super important mythologically. The Buddha is also associated with Ophiuchus. King Solomon, I would argue, is associated with Ophiuchus.
I'm grasping all of this, and I've grasped it for a while, but what was the purpose of educating or fooling, whatever, fellow citizens or descendants with stories and these works tying characters to the constellations?
Great question, Pat. So first of all, I would say, you know, going back to my Mr. Miyagi story, Mr. Miyagi wasn't trying to fool Daniel-san. He knew Daniel-san needed some help. He knew, I mean, he saw these four guys beaten up on Daniel-san, and he said, okay, I'm going to teach you karate now. So, but he had to do it through esoteric or metaphor,
Right.
for in order to teach him the right way.
Wax off.
Like
So
Morpheus,
I believe
Morpheus
that
and
these,
Neo, man.
right. So I believe that these ancient myths were for our edification, not for keeping us, fooling us or keeping us in ignorance. We had these ancient mystery schools like the Eleusinian mysteries, but
Right.
it is possible that after the cataclysm, nobody quite knew what the stories were really all about, and so there was a lot
real
of
teachings and real
it's possible that it's possible that
Yeah.
only that advanced ancient civilization, whatever it was, that was before Göbekli Tepe, knew, and after
what
the
real connection was and how it was relayed.
and so then it got turned into kind of mistaken. Well, we know this is important. We got to keep it really, really sacred, but it may have been
or was it just simply hijacked by those remaining humans who said we need to butcher these people and turn it into this story to control everyone else?
Yeah. So, I like the way. I mean,
I
That's
like
how
the way
I
you
guess it-
think.
like I like the way your mind is working,
Look,
because
that's ultimately what it was.
I'm the one that-
Through the
I'm the one
priest.
that knows where the gold is. I'm the one that knows where the gold is, David.
What's I'm saying,
Go
through
ahead, and we're gonna
these-
fool these people, and then we're going to butcher them.
Through these priesthoods, through the Catholic Church, and not to knock anybody, but the Holy Roman Empire back in the day. I mean, that's how they controlled the world. Isabella of Spain. That's how we get, the conquering of the Aztecs, et cetera, et cetera. So once they got this information and they were the keepers of the cheese, and through the priesthood and through the universities and the secret societies, they kept it tight. And then we ultimately became, like Morpheus has held us up the batteries, just the energy for the machine. They were able to just run game, dude, and just keep it hidden, which it still is.
But my question is, and this will throw you for a loop, I'm sure, David, which constellation represents the 8,000 gay pedophile priests in the Catholic Church?
I don't think there's a consolation for that one, Pat. But so let's get into so.
Does it have anything to do with a hangman's noose?
Well, so let me back up and go to your earlier point.
Welcome to the conspiracy farm, my friend.
Welcome to Militich world.
Listen. When I first met Greg Carlwood, I was I was at a secret space program convention in San Mateo. I'm from San Mateo, California originally. That's in the Bay Area. And this was back in 2014. I'd just written a book called The Undying Stars. And I was sitting there with my table full of books. It was my second book. And it's still actually one of my most popular books, The Undying Stars. And that book actually talks about, this was the first one, like I mentioned, my first book, I was taking the Bible literally, but I was still looking at the connections between the myths and the stars, and also the evidence for a global cataclysm, a global flood. Between my first book and my second book, I had to go through a lot of soul searching, because I had started to see all these constellations. I was fine seeing the constellations connected to the Greek myths or the Norse myths. I was not so fine seeing that Samson might be based on constellations, and that the book of Revelation is all based on constellations, and then going through the book of Genesis and all the way through. So when I wrote The Undying Stars, I broke it into three parts. It's kind of got three sections. First is, what is this ancient system? The second is, what could it be talking about? And what could it mean? And the third is, how was it lost? And I believe, so as I said earlier, it could have been that after the cataclysm, nobody knew what all this stuff meant. But I believe there's enough evidence around the world. You have the Native Americans who have their traditions and shamanic traditions that equipped them very well and taught them a very profound view of the universe that I believe matches up with some of the teachings that you find in the Buddhist texts, or
shamanic culture,
the Taoist texts, or in the ancient culture of India, all these ancient traditions and disciplines and wisdom. And then you have a literalist reinterpretations of ancient scriptures that happened during the Roman Empire, where all of a sudden you have one group stamping out the other groups. Like the Gnostic texts had to be buried at Nag Hammadi, I think Jeffrey, you might have mentioned Nag
Absolutely,
Hammadi.
the Nag Hammadi scriptures, absolutely.
Right. So what was going on there? There was an actual edict. I talk about this in The Undying Stars, where these are the books that can be allowed into the Bible, and if you're caught with any of the others, it's going to go very badly for you. It might end up with your death. So somebody said, well, these texts are so precious, I don't want to burn them, but I can't keep them on me or I'm in big trouble. So he buried them, or she or whoever buried them in this big jar that was later found, in the 20th century. So there was a time of stamping out, and that was the same time that, and I brought up Marcus Aurelius also for a reason, and Commodus. I talk about this in The Undying Stars, but I believe there was how did the Roman Empire look? The Roman Empire, was it Christian in the beginning when it had all those legions running around and conquering the world? It was not. They had, the statue of Jupiter. They had the temple of Jupiter, the temple of Mars, the temple of Athena, the temple of Venus. And they had the army. They had the swords. How did it become Christian?
Well, and the stamping out, man, just to go back to, it just popped in my brain of one of the videos I saw you had on of St. Patrick, and just, you talk about stamping out, when, again, this almost goes back to the whole notion of Enlil versus Enki, the reptile versus the serpent versus the eagle, etc. St. Patrick went into basically Ireland, etc., and removed all the snakes, which, of course, there aren't snakes there anywhere indigenously, but it was more the Druids. The Druids were represented by the serpent. But this was the kind of that flipping of the script, inversion of reality, where St. Patrick went in, and the lore is he rid the world of the serpents, et cetera, et cetera. But it was the Druids. It was this ancient understanding that he was really getting rid of through the Catholic Church.
Right, and I would argue that story also follows a very
it's all of the
universal
stars.
pattern that's connected to the stars, because we have gods or heroes who fight a serpent figure. In fact, Thor fights the Midgard serpent. Apollo slays a great dragon called Python to create the temple at Delphi, or to take over the temple at Delphi.
Right.
Hercules or Heracles slays a hydra, a multi-headed, and these are all I can show to be based on specific constellations in the Patrick story as well. But you're right, the Druids were teaching. So I would argue that the ancient scriptures, Bible included, are teaching actually the same thing. The same thing the Druids were teaching. Look, we're connected to nature, we're connected to the universe, and we're also connected to the invisible world in a way that is difficult to explain. But people get, premonitions or knowledge about a loved one that just cannot be explained by science, where they wake up at 3 a.m. and they know something.
Some people are more connected than others.
And some people are more sensitive to it, or more, but I think we all realize there's something more than just our physical, I think. But anyway, so I think that the ancient wisdom around the world is actually teaching very much the same principles, but then, and I believe the Bible is too. I believe these stories about these figures in the Bible are actually to teach us the same thing about connecting with others, connecting with the universe, connecting with the invisible world, connecting with your higher self. And yes, there's a writer I like a lot called Alvin Boyd Kuhn. He died in 1963. Same year Kennedy was assassinated, if you want to go down that road. But
Jeff will go down that road.
It's all
who's
connected.
JFK? Who's that?
Yeah, it's all connected. It's all connected. So, so he says, look, the ancients who worshipped all these different gods did not deny that there was a creator God, but they were teaching you to get in touch with the God that stood within reach, not the God that you can't reach. So they're talking about the God that is closer than a brother, as one of the Bible passages in Proverbs says, there is one that sticketh closer than a brother. You have access to a higher self that wants to get in touch with you, or that you need to get back in touch with. I think this is found throughout the myth. So, and then I think that it was a stamping out of that knowledge. So when the literalists took over the Roman Empire, and we could have a whole show about how that happened, then the oracle at Delphi, which had been in operation for hundreds, if not thousands of years, like at least 800 years, was shut down by the Emperor Theodosius, who came after Constantine, a few generations after Constantine. The Eleusinian Mysteries, which again had been going for hundreds of years, and accepted all people. Anyone could go to the Eleusinian Mysteries. It didn't matter if you were free or slave. It didn't matter if you were man or woman. It didn't matter if you were Greek or what the Greeks called everyone else barbarians. If you weren't Greek, you were barbarian. You could go to the Eleusinian Mysteries. They were open to everybody. The Romans, the Romans let them keep doing Eleusinian Mysteries until literalist Christianity took over. So then they made an edict that you had to be Christian within the Roman Empire. It's a pretty amazing story how that happened. And then they started going around the rest of Europe and saying to the Germanic, cultures, okay, you can either get baptized or we'll cut your head off. Which one do you want?
Right.
And then they did the same thing to the Druids. And then they started, once they had Europe and the Mediterranean nailed down, then they basically started the same thing around the world. So then, you still have this, well, we're allowed to conquer that country, of course, because we're Christian and they're not, and we're bringing them, it's this mentality of we're better, and you still have, people going around to, someone who was raised in a shamanic culture in Mongolia, and you have missionaries going to them and saying, well, Jesus is more powerful than all the gods that your shamans pray to, so why don't you come over to this one?
Right.
And I think that's very wrong to impose, to stamp out someone else's original instructions because you said that hey, ours is right and yours is wrong. Well, I can show that they're actually all based on the same system.
Well, that's kind of social engineering 101 as we've seen it here in 2019, in my humble opinion. It's like, whatever. But Patrick, we've been on for a hot minute, man. Anything you want to follow up here? Holler aboy David before we let him slide?
Incredible conversation, man. I asked a few questions just to keep things rolling, but
and you are the co-host of the show, so we kind of like that.
That's all we want. We want our guests to talk, and we shut up.
Yeah, I mean, I found his work so very fascinating, man, and I've just really all of my kind of adult life, man, I was an old Art Bell cat, man. So when guys like Richard Hoagland would come on, I would just get fascinated by these stories of, and even Graham Hancock, whatever. Everyone has, their own truth in their world, but it was just so very fascinating to hear these different alternative thoughts on the world, man. And
ancient stuff. Truth come from everywhere.
It does, man. And the ancient stuff really
fascinates
me.
This may be all the truth. We don't know.
We don't know. But as we again all have agreed on, like there was something going on way back in the day, and it's just been lost, man. What did Graham Hancock say? We're a civilization with amnesia. And we see that play out in so many different ways in society, man. David Mathisen, any social networking, any websites, where can we follow you, man? I know you've had a lot of books. Where can we pick some of that stuff up, man?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for having me on. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope it was coherent to the listeners. And, I put this out, I put this information out there because I want to help. I want to be positive with it. I want to help people with it. I'm not trying to put down other people. If you find value in any scripture and taking it literally, I'm putting this out there for the people who are looking for this and not trying to step on anybody else who isn't. But you can find so my work's on, I've got a website called starmythworld.com, which is short for Star Myths of the World. And you can find
starmythworld.com.
starmythworld.com. You can find books. You can find sample content of my books. Of course, you can find them on various bookstore websites, and you can order them at your local bookstore. But there's also a blog that's on that. Videos are listed on there. You can go to my YouTube channel. It's actually called Mathisen Corollary because that was the name of my first book. But some of those videos are linked on the Star Myth World. So if you go there, then you can just click on and subscribe if you want to. I appreciate, anyone who wants to spread this info to anyone that would be interested in it, especially if you know someone in a university who studies, who's a professor of mythology. I really, I don't know if academia will ever come around to this, but the evidence is just overwhelming. But
I think eventually they have no choice.
I would love to honestly, we do swapcasts all the time. People different ilks.
As soon as we pull away from as soon as we pull it away from state funded and national government funded education and just student funded, they'll eventually learn the truth, David.
Well, I guess that's the whole point. They've kept us from us these centuries, so we need shows like these. I want to get you together.
Department of Education.
Yes, that's a part of it. But I need to get you on board with my man Matthew LaCroix. I would love to hear you guys chat because somewhere within. Are you familiar with Matthew?
I don't think so. Although maybe, I was at a conference in 2016, and if he's, I did meet someone there. I don't remember. I haven't kept up with him since then. But I might have. If Matt was there, I might have met him. But
that's all right. I mean, your minds work very similarly, and I mean, your thought processes would be great to just come together and just tease it all out. I mean, you may not agree on everything, but ultimately, we are agreeing on the fact again that there is so much in ancient civilization that has been hidden from us, and we need to do all we can to kind of keep that conversation going because obviously there's a concerted effort to keep it from us, man. So I truly cannot thank you so much, dude. Enough for your time, dude. This was sweet, dude. Come back. I mean, as these conversations unfold, man, I truly feel, man, and we've talked about this on the show, and I'm sure maybe other civilizations have thought this. We're in a shift, man. We're in a paradigm consciousness shift right now. And,
yes, we are.
And we need these more and more of these conversations because more and more people are getting metaphorically red-pilled. And everybody thinks they're woke, but not really woke. But more people are having these kind of alternative conversations. So, again, David Mathisen, check out his YouTube page. Again, his visual illustration does so much more justice in this conversation, even though this was a dope conversation. Him showing you, particularly, Hercules and some of the other deities he spoke about. There's something to all this stuff, man. He's not pulling it out of his bunghole.
Thank you for your higher intellect, sir.
Absolutely.
Well, hey, thank you for what you guys are doing. I mean, I know we're wrapping up here, so I don't want to make it long, but I think it's
whatever
really
else you need to say, bro.
I think it's really important to have alternative voices out there, as we know 100%. That the squelching of information. I mean, we just touched on the JFK assassination, but the fact that has been covered up. I mean, is obviously the media is obviously controlled, and it's not just a recent phenomenon.
Not at all.
So, we don't necessarily agree on every political
Now you just
position.
You just spoke to our listeners.
Yeah,
no, he's been speaking to our listeners, dude. Come on now.
Well, of course, but I'm just saying that right there, everyone that listens to the Conspiracy Farm says these people are searching for the truth, and those other people are not.
Right.
Well, and like I said, we don't all have to agree with one another, and I do think we got to be careful of dead ends that, it's like, okay, these sheep are escaping the pen. Let's put a little dead end that winds over here, and they'll think they're getting away, and they're just going into this little dead end back channel.
For sure. It's a beautiful. These conversations just need to be had, man. And then everyone else needs to be adult and just do their homework and just follow up. We're not trying to tell you motherfuckers how to think or live, et cetera, et cetera. Do your homework, man. This guy's David's work. I mean, I was blowing my mind the other day, the Hercules thing. I don't know why I'm fixing on Hercules, but that trend throughout history has been absolutely amazing as far as visually illustrated throughout art, throughout history. I mean, these are beautiful conversations, man, and I enjoy having them.
And it's in the Americas, yeah. But anyway, I was going to say I commend you guys, and I love that attitude where, hey, look, we may not agree on every single point, but let's talk. Let's all agree to have a discussion and
without a doubt
try and get there.
Being in the Americas, dude, I am like miles away from Cahokia. And you come up the Mississippi River, you got Lake Egypt, you got Cairo over this way in Tennessee, you got Memphis. So there's so much Egyptian influence over here. I mean, we're just not being told the whole story, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, I hope we cross paths in person one of these days. So
we absolutely will.
Guys.
The universe will it. David Mathisen, ladies and gentlemen, peace and so much love. Thank you guys for tuning in. Peace. There will always be more.